Hello, my name is Yoshiko Bauer. Welcome to the My Special Needs Connection webinar and podcast series. As a parent of children with special needs and as a professional advocate, I understand the challenge of connecting parents and professionals with the information that they need to serve children and adults with special needs. At My Special Needs Connection, we empower parents and professionals through valuable instruction and insights of experts in the special needs community. We're excited to come alongside you to provide you with information that you need. Let's grow through the exchange of knowledge and the hope of success. Be sure to subscribe to our newsletter and YouTube channel for new releases. Please enjoy our webinars and podcasts.
Well, I'm Thomas Nelson, and I want to welcome you here to this webinar. We have our guest, Yoshiko Bauer. She's a special education advocate in the community, so she's going to be joining us. I'm Thomas Nelson. I'm a special education attorney in the community. And what Yoshi's going to be talking about is schools reopening. As many of you know, schools are starting to reopen throughout San Diego County and California as a whole. But there's not a lot of consistency that's going on in terms of programming and services and compensatory education. And so we're going to talk about that. We're going to talk about what we're seeing in the IEP team meetings in terms of what districts are offering. We're going to be talking about accommodations and services. And we're going to finish with compensatory education and the right to make up services for any loss in regression and how to approach these issues at the IEP level. So we're excited to have Yoshi with us. Again, My Special Needs Connection has a webinar series, so we encourage you to go online, sign up for the newsletter at www.myspecialneedsconnection.com. The information that we're going to be presenting here is not considered to be legal advice. Every situation is unique for every child. And so if you have questions, about specific situations, you can contact Yoshi or a special education attorney, because again, every case turns on different facts. So with that, let's go ahead and get started. And I'd like to pose a question to you, Yoshi. You do a lot of IEP meetings, and the question is, what have you been experiencing through various school districts on their reopening plan? Are you seeing uniformity or lack of uniformity? What are you seeing in that regard?
So I think that I am seeing uniformly, I have seen a lack of uniformity. So I think many schools are opening without clear guidelines for safety and educational outcomes. I think that there is a lot of disparity and variance, even within the district, but certainly from district to district. So a couple of things how things may vary are number of days and hours in which kids are being brought back to attend in-person learning. So there are some schools that are going 5 days a week as if nothing ever happened. And then there are and it's a full day. And then there's others who are going 2 days a week, some going 4 days a week. And within those 2 days and 4 days, some of them are going full days for 2 days a week or 4 days a week. And some are going 2 hours a day for those days that they're there. They're doing a combination of asynchronous learning and in-class learning, and for some it's more time and for some it's less. I'm seeing some variance in the difference between the mild, moderate, and moderate to severe special education classrooms. There are some places where they're saying that the mild, moderate are being brought back first, and they're being brought back for more days than mild, moderate. Moderate to severe being brought back more days than mild, moderate. And then there's a difference in what the class instruction looks like. So for middle schoolers and high schoolers in particular, a lot of them are being brought back. And while they're in-person learning, they're still getting Zoom.
Hmm.
Okay. So basically what that means is that they're coming into a classroom, but they're sitting in front of their computer, still doing distance learning, but they're just doing it instead of from home, they're doing it in the classroom. Okay.
Was there any reason given regarding why they would come to school, and yet it would be like
yeah, so generally it's a safety reason, but in middle school and high schools, they're going to 6 different classrooms. And because they're supposed to stay in cohorts or with the same groups of people, which you would not get because you never move with your same class from class to class in middle school and high school. So what they're doing is they're just accessing. So say you sit in one room with your cohorts, but each one of you will be accessing a different class on your computer. So, and then there's various other, schools that are doing it perhaps for staffing reasons, because they don't have enough staffing, because they have to have fewer kids in classes. So there's various reasons. And that is one of the reasons that I get a little concerned when I go into meetings, because I never know what I'm going to find. And my struggle is always to match things up with not just what they're coming in to offer, but what does this student need? For instance, they're also having changes to services. So they'll say that, well, because we're coming back and everybody has to stay in their cohort, or everybody has to do this or that, that we're going to be doing individual therapy, or we're going to be doing group therapy, whereas before the child might have had the opposite in the IEP. And also I have heard that, I have heard some OTs, SLPs talking about how it is much more of a struggle to get kids with the same kinds of goals and at the same levels, because that would be the purpose of having a small group, say in speech, is so that you have kids who are working on about the same kinds of things and are at the same levels. So, if you had a child who was verbal and in a small group, and the issue was that they were supposed to be working on goals for social speech and pragmatic speech, it would be really hard to do that if they were in a group with nonverbal children. So that is one of the issues, that some of that individuality is being taken out too, that they're being forced to pair kids based on, health and safety guidelines and cohorts. And then there's the issue of general ed, and it's being handled differently everywhere. Some schools have just outright said, sorry, but I know your child has general ed, but they're not going to get that. Others are saying, well, they can stay in their cohort in the special education classroom and access some parts of a general ed class via Zoom. And others have said, well, we're going to do it by saying you can go to playground or recess with the general ed kids. So, it's I think the biggest issue in all of this, and the biggest thing that parents need to be aware of, is that everything is going to be different, and there's so many variances that you need to ask questions.
Sure. Let me ask you a question. You talk about all this variance between school to school. Some schools seem to be much more protective, let's say, and more cautious or careful about students interacting and so on and so forth than other schools. Well, I mean, have you looked into, is there a uniform guideline, for example, from the CDE or the CDC that discusses this, or are districts pretty much leaving it up to themselves to decide what this model looks like?
So yes, the California Department of Ed has issued statements on what the safety protocols should look like for both, general and special education. And, the CDC has issued some guidelines for schools too. It depends on how schools are interpreting it, and what parts they want to embrace and what they don't want to embrace. And there again, that's why I say, it's really important for the parent to go in and ask those questions and say, what is going to happen when my child goes back to school? I suggest that they ask for a written schedule. So I want to know what my child's, what it's going to look like, what the environment's going to look like, What are they going to be doing? Who are they going to be doing it with? And then I would ask them to do a health and safety plan, which can be attached to the IEP, and ask those questions in that plan. So for instance, like the safety protocols. One of the variances that I'm seeing in schools is that some schools are saying, well, we're going to do as much outdoor learning as possible. Well, parents need to ask, what does that mean?
Sure.
Does that mean that they're in a covered area, a tent, or does it mean they're sitting at tables outside?
Right.
If you have a child who is an eloper and who runs away, or a child who has issues not being able to be in the sun, how are they going to address that? So those kinds of things need to be and you just need to know. You need to know where are they, going to be.
You and who's going to be doing the instruction too, I assume, whether it's
right. And so right. And in a little bit, we'll talk about the mask particular thing about kids who can't wear masks, because that becomes a great issue there. But just for overall for kids, parents need to know that, look at their own child. So the school may say, here is our uniform policy that, we're going to have hand washing 3 to 4 times a day, et cetera, et cetera. We're going to use hand sanitizer, et cetera, et cetera. Well, the reason why you need to ask questions and you need to have your own individual plan, there are kids who are allergic to hand sanitizer. Schools need to know that, and they need to have something else that they can use at that time. What if your child isn't efficient and can't appropriately wash their hands? Who's going to help them? Are they just going to step up to the sink like everybody else, but not end up with clean hands? So those kinds of things. There are some kids who have a lot of issues with salivating or drooling. Who's going to change that mask? How often does that mask need to be changed? Once it's wet, or things like that, before it becomes a health hazard. I think parents need to ask questions. If your school is one of the ones who is differentiating how much time you come back based on mild, moderate to severe, you need to ask how they determine that, because there's very many different reasons. And if you, for say, have a child who would be considered moderate to severe because of academics, but yet they're not in the moderate to severe class because at that time it has kids who are more physically violent. Well, does that mean that just because the district has placed your child in a mild, moderate class that you're not going to get to come back as much because of you're not technically in a moderate to severe class? So you need to ask how they are determining this. You need to look at more supports. So you need to know if your child is still going back to school and going to sit in front of a computer, then you need to have, if your child is a child who has struggled during distance learning at home, you can be sure that they're still going to struggle at school. And so even if they might not have had an aid before, but we know that they have attention issues and they can't stay focused doing individual work like that, you may need to ask for aid support during those asynchronous times. And you may need more OT support, because if kids are going to be sitting outside but indoors, they have things like therabands and preferential seating, and they have things like bouncy chairs and things like that. Well, you need to be able to have some of those things outside also if they're sitting outside. And so I think those are questions that need to be asked. And especially one of the issues revolves around asynchronous time.
I was going to ask you, you used that term a couple times, just for parents who maybe aren't familiar with that term, or they heard it and don't really know what it is. Could you explain what that means?
Well, what I always say when I go into meetings is that asynchronous means not working. It means it's different than everything else, and it's kind of off by itself. Say you have a bunch of synchronized swimmers. The one who's asynchronous is the one that's doing its own thing and not coordinated with anybody else. The same with the watch. If it's asynchronous, it's not keeping the right time. So schools vary. Some schools are saying, well, we're going to school for 2 or 4 days a week, and you're going to be at school for 2 hours. And then the next 4 hours, you go home and do asynchronous work. Some are saying you're in school all day, 4 days, and the 5th day all day is in asynchronous work. So it's basically the same as distance learning, except in many cases, again, there's variances. Some districts, when they do asynchronous, they actually have a teacher on the Zoom who can be asked questions, who's not really teaching, but is there. Others, it's just all independent time. And you really need to know that, because again, if you have a child who can't access independent learning, that's, something that can't be done. And I did ask at one school about a child who has a full-time aide for education and attention purposes and things like that. And I said, the parent mentioned that this child is greatly struggling during asynchronous time. And I asked about getting an aide during that time. And the response was, well, it's not, we expect kids to be doing their own homework, as in work at home, not necessarily homework assigned after you're in class. And so we're not required to provide aides for kids doing homework, which is true, but it's not homework. It's during the school hours. They're having these kids do this independent asynchronous time during school hours. And so again, if it's during school hours, the school needs to provide the same accommodations and services that they're offered is. So in other words, it can't just be that it's distance learning, but now it's distance learning all on your own. So I think that's something parents really have to look into, about that. And I think one of the, things is to request that extra support. Always get a prior written notice, but, be very clear and request what you think your child needs. My child needs the same OT supports that they would get in the classroom if they're sitting outside working or during asynchronous times. And use the goals and accommodations to show that if you need to add times. So, my child has goals for attention, therefore it isn't reasonable to expect that they can access 4 or 6, however many hours of independent asynchronous time on their own. And then get request a prior written notice if the district refuses those things. But I think it's so important to ask those questions and know ahead of time. Give me a written schedule. Let me know what this distance learning, this back in-person learning is going to look like, because it will not, I guarantee you, it's not almost, I would say at least 95% of the time, it's not going to look similar to what it was before kids went out on distance learning.
Right. And, we've mentioned this in previous webinars, but due to COVID, the IDEA was never waived. The rules and regulations are still in effect. One of which is that the child's program must be individualized to meet their unique needs. Now, obviously, there's been a tension, with COVID and safety. Schools were forced to shut down. And so we, and the law had to obviously accommodate that and go to the distance learning. But the rules and regulations for the IDEA have not been waived. So I recommend to parents keep that in mind, as Yoshi's been speaking about, finding out a lot of details and information about what that school day is going to look like and making recommendations as to what your child needs. Remember, the way the law works, it's up to the team to come up with a program to meet the child's unique individual needs. It's not what's convenient for the district. It may be more convenient for the district to do things a certain way in the classroom. But again, aside from a mandate from the government officials on safety, the school district has to create a program that meets your child's unique needs. So always go into the meeting, I think, with that framework, not with the framework like, well, this is all we can do due to the circumstances. The school district might be saying that, but turn it around and say, let's talk about my child's unique needs and how can we meet those unique needs, even in this hybrid or a different environment.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Good. So a minute ago, you mentioned the mask requirements, and I take it you've seen some variance in that regard with respect to children with disabilities who aren't able to wear a mask. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Absolutely. So there's so much disparity, as you know, that has even resulted in great discussion and division amongst adults, even in businesses and things like that, amongst private business, public things, about wearing masks. So you can imagine that it's an issue in schools. But basically, the federal government and the state government and the county regulations that they've issued all have provisions that say that if somebody, due to their disability, and there's various things, so I've seen schools interpret it differently, that yes, it also says that if you have a medical reason, say asthma or something like that, that you don't have to wear a mask. But in the California Department of Education has released guidelines that say we follow the CDC, we follow the federal government. And it's basically, it says, if they can't wear a mask due to their disability, they don't wear one, period. It doesn't say get a doctor's note, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, so now what do you do if you are saying yes, and most districts are? I haven't really come across any districts who are saying a child must wear a mask. But what they're saying is what to do with that child and how to educate them if they can't wear a mask. Great variance there. Okay, so, many districts are just saying, well, we're just going to have to do extra social distancing. We're going to put up barriers, plexiglass or cardboard barriers. We're going to do more cleaning and we're going to wear more PPE, the people who are around. And most of them have those guidelines on their websites. There are some districts, though, who are saying, for instance, some who went back in phases were saying, okay, well, the children with most severe disabilities can come back in phase 1. However, those kids were many, many times the ones who couldn't wear a mask. And so they were told, oh, sorry, they just can't come back if they can't wear a mask. Later on, some of them were being allowed to come back with some plexiglass or other barriers as teachers got vaccinated. There still is some disparity in that there are some districts who are saying we just can't teach these kids in the classroom. And so I feel like there are several questions then that parents need to ask and several actions that need to be taken, because if you cannot have them in the classroom, first of all, again, you need to ask questions and you need to say what guidelines, what laws, what regulations, what health codes are you going by that says they can't be in the classroom if they can't wear a mask? Okay, you need to get something in writing from them. These are not things, these Americans with Disabilities Act and things like that, these are not, and these health codes in time of pandemic, these are not things that people can just make up on their own, so ask them, where does this come from? Who says, show me this in writing. Okay, and again, I would ask for explicit details. What are you going to be doing with my child? Some people have been told your child's going to sit in a tent outside all day long with an aide. Well, so you want to know how they get their services. How are they going to get their social time? How are they going to access their general ed time? You want to ask these questions and you want to know. You want to know about things like, again, health and safety. There are some districts who are providing students and parents with a health and safety plan that's already done up that only addresses what they will do with kids who are not wearing masks, saying that we're going to keep them in a tent, or they have to be kept away from other kids, or et cetera, et cetera. But it is not an individualized health and safety plan, even though they call that, because they're not addressing individual health and safety needs. So again, like I was talking about before, parents have a right to say, let's do a health and safety plan. How are you going to address the fact that my child runs away? How are you going to address the fact that my child is sitting in a tent and it's pouring rain and he's not allowed in the classroom, or it's 100 degrees outside? How are you going to address the fact that, my child is wants to pick things up off the ground and put them in their mouth? Just various things like that. You need to make sure and insist that individualized health and safety plan really is individualized. And you want to find out about things like equity and teacher time. So if your child has to be outside educated in a tent by himself because he can't wear a mask, or in any other setting, say, even if they said, well, we'll put him in a classroom. If he's by himself, who's educating him? Is he getting the same amount of credentialed special education or general education teacher time as his classmates are? Or is he being with an aide all day long? Again, if the kids that are in the classroom are accessing a teacher who's doing instruction with them, and this student is sitting outside in a tent or in another classroom, is he back to distance learning? Is he being made to sit in front of a computer again, where the rest of the class gets in-person teacher time? So these are things that you need to question, and make sure that you get in writing. How is this going to work? If your student has small group speech and they won't let him have that because he doesn't wear a mask, you need to question those things. How are you going to follow the IEP and still keep my child segregated? If your student has, again, use the goals and the accommodations that are in the IEP. If they're pragmatic speech goals, if they're social goals, if we've taught a child for the last 2 years, had goals for them to follow and mimic and do what their classmates do, if we put in peer buddies, if we've said, that they want to be in small groups and do this and that, how do you account for taking all that away? And how are you going to address that? Because now we're telling a child that they can't do what we've taught them for the last 2 years to do. And the last thing is transportation. So some schools are saying, well, we'll just take the kid on the bus, even if they can't wear a mask. But when they get to the classroom, they can't be with kids. Well, what's the difference? You're actually in tighter quarters. So you want to know what that transportation is going to look like. In some districts, they're being told you must put a mask goal in the IEP. Again, it needs to be individual though. And so, you need baselines. Some kids are working on masks, just putting it in front of them. Like they have such sensory issues that you can't even just start with wearing a mask for 5 minutes or whatever. You just having it in front of them and then working up to them touching it and that kind of stuff. So you can't just put the same mask goal in everybody's IEP. You need to know where you're starting from, what is a reasonable expectation. And you have to make sure that because if your child doesn't wear a mask at all and fights it all day long, how much valuable academic and other services are being lost while they're focusing on the mask goal. So, you need to make sure that there's an appropriate amount of time spent on other things and not just mask goals. So those are kind of some of the issues that I see. And again, I can't stress it enough, ask for data on all of these issues that I talked about, that if you're going to put my child back in school and they're sitting in front of a computer, how are they doing? How much extra aid time are they going to need? Ask for that data, and always ask for the prior written notice, because keep in mind, there is such disparity and variance in these guidelines that even the schools are not sure. So remember, it is not the school, it is not the teacher, it is not the principal who is making these decisions. In some cases, I have seen where different people have come down and from admin and ordered teachers and principals saying, this is our guideline. And yet when I go and search on the school district's website, they've posted different guidelines. So imagine how confusing that is for principals and teachers too. When you're saying, well, wait a minute, this is the CDC guideline. This is the California Department of Ed guidelines. And they're saying, well, all we can do is the guideline that I got from admin. And the bigger the district, the more admin is involved. And so the admin for the speech department might give certain, things. And so that's why you really need to get it in writing. You're saying these are guidelines and regulations. Let me see them. I need a copy of those regulations. Who told you those were the regulations? And ask for those prior written notices, because honestly, it's not worth arguing over, because these people who you're talking with at the immediate meeting are not making the decisions.
Sure. Well, there's several potential legal issues with the mask policy where students are excluded from the classroom. I'd like to just share one PowerPoint of the Department of Education. So this is something that you may want to go online, find, and actually print out and bring to an IEP meeting if your child can't wear a mask and your district has a policy of excluding your child from the classroom. But as you can see, it basically says if children can't wear a mask, then they can't be required to wear a mask. So very clear, very definitive that they don't have to wear a mask if they can't. But it goes on to say that they must not be excluded from educational environments if their disability prevents them from wearing a face covering. So stopping right there, I mean, that certainly brings into question a policy by the district to exclude those children from the classroom. Now, the district may say, well, yeah, it's not excluding from the classroom because they're being educated outside, but in essence, you could make the argument that they are, because if the other students are being educated in the classroom and your child is singled out in a tent outside, are they really being educated in the classroom? I think you could make the argument that they are not. But it goes on further to say the district's LEAs must continue to adhere to the least restrictive environment requirements of the IDEA. They must avoid implementation of policies related to face coverings that result from a denial of FAPE under the IDEA. So the least restrictive environment means the most exposure to non-disabled children as is appropriate. And one could make the argument that if a child is separated or excluded from the rest of the classroom, they're put in a tent outside while the rest of the students are inside in a classroom, they're certainly not getting that exposure. And as Yoshi pointed out, maybe it's even a goal for them to model regular education peers in socialization and learning proper behavior. And you can imagine the problems it could create if all of the students are lining up to go into the classroom and this one student is told, no, you can't model those students, you have to be separate in a different setting. So there's certainly, that issue. I would also say that school districts cannot come up with a policy that is more restrictive than the law. They can add protections to state and federal guidelines regarding the IDEA or special education rights, but they can't take away rights. So if the school district has a policy that is much more restrictive than the law, that also is subject to scrutiny. Also, I've heard that sometimes the IEB teams come to the meeting with a health plan that has this mass policy we've just been talking about, and it's non-negotiable. It's attached to the IEP, but there's no ability to discuss what might be reasonable accommodations for children who can't wear masks. Yoshi mentioned some earlier. Dividers, social distancing, other plexiglass, other things that could potentially be used to protect children in the classroom from children who could not wear a mask. But if the district comes to the IEP with this pre-made health plan that is only, one direction, the parents can't ask questions, they have no right to provide input, then one could argue that that's what's called predetermination. Predetermination is where the district comes up with a plan as part of the IEP that is not subject to discussion by the team, including the parent. One of the prominent provisions in the law is parent participation. As a parent, you have an equal right to participate in any discussion regarding your child's programming. And if that right is taken away, it's a take it or leave it. Here's the plan. You want your child back at school. You have to sign the plan in order for the IEP to take place. One certainly could argue that that's predetermination. Any other points you have, Yoshi, about what to do in that kind of situation?
So because you brought up about, that you don't have to agree to that. So, I would say, because a parent does not have to at any time, not just during a pandemic or for these reasons, but a parent does not have to agree to the entire IEP that's presented. Is that correct?
That is correct. You can agree to part of the IEP, and that part has to be implemented.
Right. So my suggestion is, when you're asking these questions, of course, you're doing it during an IEP meeting, make sure that team notes, team action notes, parent concern areas, that they're noting your concerns, they're noting your requests, and that they write in there that you're requesting that prior written notice. But then later on, when they say, well, it's all or nothing, I have heard districts who are saying that their offer of FAPE is the health and safety plan, which we know can't be true because the health and safety plan doesn't contain anything about service hours or, anything, setting, anything. So you can sign parts of it so that offer of the rest of the real offer of FAPE, which is so many hours of services, the accommodations, the goals, that is legally in effect. But right on, and it's an issue because schools are still doing Zoom meetings, and sometimes they'll say, well, we'll sign for you, or we'll send you the DocuSign, or there's many different Google signs. There's so many different kinds, and you just sign. There's nowhere for you to write anything. Okay, so send an email, put it in writing, mail it to the school, whatever you do, put it in writing and say, this is what I wanted to say. The signature page that I want you to check that I agree to certain portions and I want it to say with the exception of, and write, write what the things you don't agree to. And if it's just the individual health and safety plan, write that, and then have them send you a copy of that signature page. And then if you feel like they came and they would not discuss at all, and they told you, look, this is what we were told to offer, can't offer anything else. And this goes for any time when you're doing an IEP, that you can, write in, with the exception of this, and always get a copy of it. But you can also have them not check where it says that parents were able to participate, that the district allowed parent participation. There is a checkbox for that in the IEP signature page portion. Make sure that they don't check it. One of the issues with the online stuff that we're doing now is that districts are coming and they're checking all of those things about the Medi-Cal, agreeing to the Medi-Cal, and did the district consider your concern. They're all coming pre-checked. Look at those and tell them, I don't want that checked. I don't feel like I had a say in this. So I think those are really important things that parents can do. And then again, be firm with it. Like, I've gone in and I've said, look, I want this child in school with everybody else in the classroom with reasonable accommodations on Monday morning. If you can't, then give us a prior written notice. You don't have to ask. You can request, just tell them what it is you want. You don't have to ask them if it's okay or anything else, and I think it's really important, to know every detail, and they have to give you those details.
Yoshi, what are you seeing in IEP meetings regarding the discussion of compensatory education due to COVID and the missed classroom time, distance learning, et cetera?
Right. So even though, they always say it, it's hard to teach an old dog new tricks, or, it's really hard to change. And so, old habits die hard. Teachers, administrators have always been told, the issue of compensation is not to be discussed at an IEP meeting. Now, that's not necessarily a legal thing. It's not forbidden, but that's how districts have always been. So now you're going to talk about in a minute about what's the change in some of the governor's regulations, but it's not really getting down to the teacher and administrator level. So I may quote that new law that the governor signed, but they're saying, well, we're being told no by our district. So, again, we have talked about this issue before, preparing people in a couple of the past webinars about keeping data. So, you make sure that you've kept your data all along and have that together, and you present that to the IEP saying, look, I've sent you emails, here's some videos, here's schoolwork. He hasn't been able to access this, or, he hasn't had any of his services. Now that you're back in, a brick and mortar setting, you want to ask them for their documentation. What's the data that you've been keeping? Where's the data on progress? What kind of progress can you say that my child's been making? Ask for the provider logs, the logs that speech and OT and APE and PT are required to keep, that tell you how much time they spent, what did they do, what goals were worked on. Ask for those. Okay, so you want to document that, all of those kinds of things, gather that documentation, and then you want to ask for any assessments. So it could be informal academic assessments. If you feel your child has really regressed academically, you can ask for some of the emotional assessments to be done if you feel like your child has really regressed in that area, speech, any of those things, you can ask for them to redo those assessments. And if they say no, you can request an independent educational evaluation so that we get those things and you can show, look, compared to this, from last assessments, my child has regressed a lot. Safe schoolwork, things like that, and put the burden of the proof on the district. I want to see what you got. Have you kept any data? Do you know, what, how can you say, if they want to come to an IEP meeting and say, oh, your child's making great progress, force them to tell you, how do you know? I was at an IEP meeting where they started out telling me all this wonderful progress, and mom says, this can't be because, my child couldn't even access online. So when I said, okay, let's go back and I want you to tell me, where's your data? Show me where you got these numbers from. And they didn't have any. So they went away and they said, we'll come back in a month or, 60 days and we'll give you some, we'll do some informal assessments. And when they came back, the progress that they had was 20 to 30% lower than what they had came to the first meeting and said. So never just take their word for it. If you don't think that, if they're saying your child can do certain things and they can't, say, show me the data. And if they can't, then redo the assessments to show me where this child is and what the present levels are. And then, ask for that compensatory at the meeting. How are you going to mitigate this learning loss? What are you going to do about it? Okay. And one of the things that you need to remember is that mitigation can come in various ways. So, I think it's very clear if, as it has been in some cases, that say speech was almost non-existent, or if the OT never got any of the adapted writing utensils, adapted paper, adaptive seating things, fidgets, behavior charts to a parent, I think, those things you can kind of do pound for pound and say, hey, my child needs extra speech, compensatory speech, or OT. Academics, it's, a little harder because not every kid can benefit from tutoring or things like that. So one of the things that some districts are doing now is saying, well, we are going to offer, and it's going to be in the summer, and it's an addition to ESY, but it's going to be kind of an extra setting for learning loss. Okay. Again, it's the issue of predetermination and the child not having to fit the program fitting the child. Historically and legally under IDEA, ESY is not for making progress on goals. It is to maintain where they are, to make sure it's for kids who would regress so much that they wouldn't and would take longer to recoup that regression in their goals. So they work on just enough during an extended school year so that they maintain that level that they're at. Or if they're in the middle of learning a new critical skill, that they don't lose all of it while they're off and have to start from ground zero again. So these educational programs, if the district is going to offer them as a compensatory or as a way to mitigate learning loss, again, it needs to be tailored individually to your student. It needs to be a program that is derived to make progress, not just the same old, well, we're just offering them more hours in school. Like, what are you doing during those hours? What goals are going to be worked on? How are you going to give, to make sure that they're going to catch up and not just maintain where they are? Because if we're saying they've already regressed and you're just going to offer me more hours just so that they can stay and not regress any further, that's not compensatory. And that's not mitigating a learning loss. So I think, don't let them come and say, well, we're going to offer this. You need to say, how does that affect my child? How's it going to be individual? What goals are going to be worked on? How much more speech time, OT services are they going to get to mitigate that learning loss?
Right. Yeah, I often tell parents there's that old analogy of the cafeteria versus cooking from scratch. In a cafeteria, there's a pre-select items. You can't go to a cafeteria and ask for a specific dish that's not on the menu. But when you cook from scratch, you can go to the grocery store and buy the ingredients that you want to create the dish that you like. And really, the IDEA calls for cooking from scratch. Everything has to be put together to meet your child's unique needs. It's not up to the convenience of the district. So as Yoshi mentioned, beware of ESY programs that are called compensatory education, because it might end up just looking like a tutoring classroom to try to, make up for a loss across the board, as opposed to specific areas of need where maybe your child regressed and needs help being brought up. So again, just as Yoshi's mentioned all through this webinar, questions. We always recommend giving the district at least 24-hour notice to tape record the meeting. That is your legal right. It's not going to appear litigious. A lot of parents do it, and it's very, very helpful. You can take notes and pay attention, during an IEP meeting, but sometimes when you're taking scrupulous notes, you're not able to pay attention at the same time and ask questions. So the tape really relieves you of that obligation or need to take notes. You can just freely listen, and the tape recorder is taking down all the information. And if there's ever a discrepancy between what was said and what was written in the notes, you have some proof. But do that. Ask those questions. You have an equal right to participate in this process, and you have a right to have all of your questions answered. And they have to make a specific offer of placement and services. So really dig for that information. And as Yoshi mentioned, the governor has issued guidelines earlier that compensatory education is one of those topics to be discussed at an IEP meeting because of distance learning and COVID. Didn't necessarily used to be that way, but it is now. It is definitely on the table for discussion. So don't let a district say, well, that's not really our prerogative in an IEP meeting. No, you can Google it, look it up. Governor Newsom in his guidelines specifically stated that. So it is a topic. And as Yoshi mentioned, hopefully you've kept data on your child's ability or inability to access distance learning, how much time they actually could attend to the instruction or not attend, how their reading, writing, math, behavior skills have stayed the same or maybe regressed since distance learning. All of those things are really important to discuss when you go into this meeting, because that's the springboard to getting compensatory education. Again, compensatory education is designed to compensate or make up for a loss. And there's been certainly a tremendous loss to children's education in the special education setting, because of COVID. That's not true of all children. Some children actually maybe like distance learning and maybe even improve, but there's going to be a lot of children who weren't able to access their education online. It was just too difficult, too much distraction, ability to attend, behaviors, etc. And that's why compensatory education was specifically referenced by Governor Newsom. So do you have any concluding thoughts for our webinar, Yoshi?
Yeah, so I think parents just really need to realize that, that as you said before, IDEA, the laws which govern both the federal and the state laws which govern IEPs, have not been waived. Timelines have not been waived. The assessments, the way they do assessments, the offer of pay, none of that's been waived. So don't let a school tell you that they have and that they have to change hours or times or anything else. Yes, now they're required to put in this blurb about what happens if schools are closed for more than 10 days or something like that due to emergencies. That still doesn't change fate. Okay. And so remember that the I in IEP still stands for individual. The I in IHSP, the individual health and safety plan, still stands for individual. And so the districts cannot come with these things and say, here's what you have to have. Here's because we're coming back and we're limited, they have to do this. They have to do that. This is a program that we have to offer. You have the right to make it individualized. And if they absolutely can't, and your child suffers and regresses because of it, then you have the right to request that they mitigate that loss with compensatory services or in other ways. But it's still individual. They cannot come to you at any point in time and say, this is all we can offer. This is what we're doing for all kids. This is the program we've come up with to mitigate all kids learning. That is not something that can happen. And the second thing is, you know, they have to tell you, don't let them say, well, we're not sure how that's going to look. We're not sure what we're going to do, because that would be very scary. I don't think that it would be realistic or reasonable for a school district to expect a parent who has a child who maybe has some severe behaviors and who is known for eloping and running away frequently. If you sit at the IEP meeting and say, what are you going to do? If you're going to teach them outside, how are you going to keep them from running away? And they can't tell you. You know, if you're going to say, what are you going to do if my child's in a tent? What are you going to do when they're on distance learning and sitting in the classroom on a computer and they can't access things and they don't have an aide? If they can't tell you, you have a right to say, then give me a prior written notice. I need something. I need a schedule. I need to know what you're going to do. Get these questions answered before I send my child back to school.
Wow. Well, that's great information, Yoshi. We really appreciate you joining us for this really important topic. And we hope that the information that's been provided to you can help you navigate this process. It's a challenging time, but hopefully we're getting through this. As I mentioned earlier, go on to the website, www.myspecialneedsconnection.com. And we are going to be presenting more webinars in the future. You can get on the newsletter and find out information about upcoming webinars that are going to help parents navigate this process. So again, Yoshi, thank you for joining us and giving us this information.
You're welcome.
Bye now.